Do you mind if we start by going around the table and having you all introduce yourselves and how this all started?
All right. You want to start? Sure. I'm Julie Hatchell, and I'm part of a group called Kitchen Session. And I'll let Brad tell you a little bit more about our group in a little bit. But
can you hold the mic? The session's being recorded.
Hello. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm Julie Hatchell, and I'm with the group called Kitchen Session. And Brad will tell you more about our group in just a moment.
Hi, I'm Marguerite Graffois. I'm the president of the Louisiana Vintage Dancers. I'm also a member of the Kitchen Session band. I play the fiddle.
I'm Brad Larpenter. I'm a member of Kitchen Session. I play flute and whistle. And this is my son Braden. He plays drum.
Hi, I'm Jim Cook. We dance with the Louisiana Vintage Dancers. We've been dancing probably about 12, 13 years now.
Hi, I'm Lois Cook, and I'm with the Louisiana Vintage Dancers.
Yeah.
Well, we are just excited to be here and talk about the hobbies that we love so much. Thank you for joining us. We have come from Baton Rouge. The Louisiana Vintage Dancers, we practice once a week in Baton Rouge so that we can learn the dances. We often practice to find recorded music, which is actually the tunes that would have been played for that dance. When Kitchen Session is accompanying us, they will either play the tune that goes with the dance. Often there was a dance with a certain name, a tune with a certain name. So when the choreographers made these dances, they had the tunes to match them exactly, because some of them are quite unique and need just the right music to go with the tune. So we often, some of us, we make our own costumes, we study and research. So what we're presenting to you today is just the tip of the iceberg of the things that we have learned about our costumes, the time period, how the current events of the day affected not only the dress, but the tunes and the manners, and therefore the culture of the time. We want to be sure you understand that the 1800s are not, it's hard to just take them, pluck them out of a time period from obscurity and just talk about the costumes. The things that you would see at that time were affected by the current events of the day. So we hope to intertwine those to give you a better understanding of why they did what they did and looked how they looked. So we're going to start with the 1800s. The time periods that LVD, the dancers, dance from is three main time periods during the 1800s. The first one is the Regency period, which was the early 1800s. You would recognize it today by any of the Jane Austen movies. That's that time period. The middle 1800s was the time, that antebellum time. Of course, the Civil War happened at that time. Very different silhouette, like an hourglass. So we'll talk about that. And then the last time period is the 1890s, so the roaring 90s, right before we went into 1900. So we will start down at this end of the room. Lois, if you'll stand up and talk about your Regency attire.
Hi, as Marguerite.
I have some handouts for the time period that she's going to be talking about, so I'm going to stand up and give one to one side of the room and one to the other.
Hi, my dress is from the Regency period. This period started about 1795 through about 1820. The first time I remember seeing a movie with somebody dressed in the Regency period was The Buccaneer, about the War of 1812, Louisiana, and Governor Claiborne's daughter was wearing a Regency dress. The Regency period tried to get away from the ostentatiousness of the Revolutionary periods with the wigs and the very embellished dresses. And so at that time, the dresses became closer to the body, more, they were very infatuated with classical Greek dress, or at that time they were starting to make discoveries about the Egyptian tombs and all, and so they were enamored of the Egyptian type of dresses as well. So these dresses, you can recognize because the waistline is right under the bust, an empire, or some people say empire waist. And so the sleeves were puffy, and a lot of that is because they wanted the straight line and the puffy sleeves to kind of emulate Greek column instead of a wide skirt. The hair at that time, they wore their hair up toward the crown with curls. They embellished it with flowers or pearls, jeweled crowns, feathers. Sometimes they, for fancy dress balls, they would wear turbans, which was kind of like the Eastern or the Egyptian type of clothing. The gloves, always wore gloves. In this time period, the gloves usually came above the elbow. Later on in the century, the gloves would be the little short gloves that you see during the 1860s. They carried fans. The fans were to keep them cool, but also, if I can get this one open, also to send messages. Like, for instance, fanning slowly, I'm married. Quicker, I'm engaged. This meant I want to talk to you. And then this one, you didn't want to see, it meant I want to get rid of you. And I'm going to let Jim tell you about the 1860, mid-1819.
Oh, okay, we're going to try and go chronologically. So if anyone else has something to add about the Regency, I'll add a few things. Talking about the way that current events affected dress. This time period was the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, anything military has a big effect on everything else. This silhouette is what Napoleon thought was the most complimentary to a woman's figure. So, of course, what he liked is what everybody wore. So Josephine had a closet full of these dresses. The fabrics we sew, so that we know a lot about fabrics. The fabrics they used were thinner. And yes, you wore the same thing during the wintertime as you did in the summer. Now, they would put a short Spencer jacket over this made of wool, flannel. They also had some long pelisse coats and things, but this fabric would be worn year-round. So to help the ladies stay warm, they used shawls or capes. And it's a funny story about Josephine. She was known to have a bunch of shawls. Of course, they were the finest silks, wool challis, but Napoleon did not like to see her covered up. So there was a story that she was in the room one day, and he came in, and she had on one of these shawls. He grabbed it off her and said, "You're too covered up," and he threw that in the fire. And she kind of rolled her eyes and told her maidservant, "Go get me another one." So apparently this happened a lot. So a lady would not be without some kind of covering. What Lois has on would be like evening wear with the short sleeves and a low neckline. That would be for the evening. During the day, they would cover this up with a piece of organza. It was a chance to use your nice lace, cover the neckline, and they would have detachable sleeves that she could put in up underneath and attach them at the shoulder so there wouldn't be bare arms. I did bring a show and tell for you. Coming out of the 1790s, the silhouette was very straight, not similar to this, but not so buxom. Everything was very flat. If you happen to watch the movie Elizabeth, during that time, Elizabethan time, the corsets of that time actually pulled their shoulders back very uncomfortably. So they ended up with a silhouette where they were very straight. The corsets had a busk, which was a piece of wood that went down the front to make sure that you stayed straight. They had boots. In the late 1790s, the boots had no heel. They wanted no heel. Well, coming into the Regency time, they wanted a little heel. So these are reproduction early Regency boots. You can see that they have a low heel. Well, the boot makers and the shoemakers didn't want to have to redo all of their shoe molds. So what they do is in the 1790s, you take a flat boot and they added what they called a French heel. So you can see that the heel is black. They just tapped this little heel onto those boots and voila, you have a boot that has a heel on it. And they're very uncomfortable, but that's what they did. Eventually, they did come around and make new forms with the heel included. Anyone else have anything with the Regency? Oh, we wanted to talk about the dress that Julie has on. I'll let her talk about it. This construction is very unique.
This particular dress is a bib front dress. Lois's dress opens in the back, and this particular dress opens in the front. It comes and attaches here as a bib. the back, and the back is attached to the sleeves. So the way that this dress is put on is you put on the back first, the sleeves, then you pull up the bib, and underneath the bib is actually a small corset that ties. Then you pull up the bib and you pull the tie into the back. So there are no, of course there weren't zippers of the time period or anything like that, and so everything is held together with ties.
One of the few dresses where a lady could dress herself, because if not, everything opens and closes in the back, and you have to have someone to help you. Lois's dress is made out of cotton. Julie's dress is made out of sari silk, which is one piece of fabric which she has artfully arranged and made into a dress. And the silks and the cottons from India are still made the same way they were made back then. So this fabric would be correct. And silk is very thin and pliable and moving, and that's what they wanted to see. Anyone else on Regency? All right, Jim?
Hi. The attire I have is representative of the mid-1800s. It's a frock coat. It was worn by the gentlemen of the day, mostly every day. I believe they wore these out. Did not have the tails like you would see in more of the formal wear. They were usually made of cotton, and they were knee length. The waistcoat has a lay-down shawl collar, waist length, straight hemline. The neckwear was a variation at this time of a bow tie, any combination. They had started to get away from the high collars and the cravats that were worn earlier in the 1800s. Pants actually had gone toward the trousers, similar to what men wear today. They had gotten away from the breeches, again, that were more common in the early 1800s. Gloves, men wore gloves all the time. White gloves at a ball or a dance, that was a must. I believe that's
So you can see, none of us have on an 1860s. But these are some of our dancers. This is actually one family. Hello, Borns. They're coming to us fresh off the road from Kentucky. Chloe, can you stand up, please? Chloe has the closest thing to an 1860s day dress. You can see that the waist is lower. So you see we've moved from where Lois is. The Regency is the only time period during the 1800s where the waist was not emphasized. So from the early Regency to the 1860s, you can see the waist has dropped, and once again, the women's waist has appeared in the silhouette. So you can see that she has on a small print, cotton. You can turn around. You can see there are gathers around the waist, and the skirt of this dress would be very full. A woman's dress could have 5 to 7 yards in the bottom of her skirt. It's a lot of fabric to carry around. Usually the front could be gathered through the 50s and the 60s. It could be a fan front blouse that has gathers like that. It could have pleats. The shoulder was usually dropped, the shoulder seam was dropped off of the shoulder. So you can see that her hair is parted down the middle. Characteristic to this time period, there was no loose hair around the face. So the curls from the 1820s went away, and now the silhouette they wanted was flat on top and wide. So there were bangs, there was nothing on top but a split the hair down the middle. The woman needed to look demure here. So that's why the sloping shoulders and the hourglass waistline, the fabric with these mini prints, cotton, a hoop skirt. So you see we've moved from the column shape to an hourglass. So she's a young lady, so she has on a modest hoop or a crinoline underneath there to pull the fullness of the skirt out. Thank you very much. So Brad is going to talk to us about some of the other revolutions that were happening in the mid-1800s.
There's often been discussion about when did the sewing machine start influencing the fashion, and there's a lot of misconception around in 1860 you wouldn't have had sewing machine made clothes. That's not exactly true. all the way back in 1790, they started developing what would then become the sewing machine. In 1790, a guy by the name of Thomas Saint made a machine that would do a chain stitch. It was different than what we have today. There was also in the late 1700s the advent of a eye-pointed needle. You know, in hand stitching, the point's at one end and the eye of the needle is at the other end. But on a machine, the eye is down where the point is. That development of that type of needle was from the late 1700s. And then in around 1829, a guy by the name of Timonier, who was a Frenchman, came up with a machine. It was mostly made of wood, but it had the needle and would stitch the fabric. It would only do a chain stitch, which a modern machine has a top thread and a bottom thread, and it interlocks them. It took the top thread down, formed a loop, held it there until the next stitch came down, and it chained them together. This was good because you only needed a top stitch, but the drawback was that if it came unraveled, the entire chain would come off. Today we still use chain stitch in certain industries where we need a temporary seam, but back then it was what they were making clothes out of. And in fact, Timonier's machine in 1830 was used by factories to outfit the French army. So here we have in the 1830s an entire army wearing machine-sewn, factory-made clothes. So it was a lot, you know, when we started looking into it, it was a lot earlier than we originally thought it was. And then, of course, you've probably heard the name Singer for sewing machines. Well, there were a few that preceded Singer that came up with individual developments. For instance, the lock stitch itself, the intertwining of the top thread and the bottom thread to make a stitch that wouldn't pull out. Singer didn't develop that. Like we said, the eye-pointed needle came from the 1790s. He didn't develop that. What he did, though, is he combined all of those ideas into one machine, and he laid it out much the way we see a machine today, with a flat bed and an arm that comes over and the needle that comes down from the top. Previous designs, there was one where the Elias Howe, a lot of people credit Elias Howe with the invention of the modern sewing machine. Well, he made a machine that sews, but the needle goes sideways from the side, and you had to do a few stitches and then reset everything, and then do a few stitches more and then reset everything. So that clearly was not the sewing machine that we know today. So by the 1840s, late 1840s, you start having factory-made clothes in the cosmopolitan areas. We're talking, you know, in Paris, possibly in New York, you would have had, now in Louisiana, in rural areas, you still wouldn't have had, you know, every family wouldn't have had a sewing machine. It was, in fact, Isaac Singer that pioneered the availability of a sewing machine to a family, because what he did is he was the first to do what they call hire purchase, where you could purchase the machine on credit and pay it off over time. And this meant that a household could acquire a sewing machine, and then they could use that sewing machine doing sewing jobs and use the money they got from the sewing jobs to help pay the machine off over time. And that's what finally made it affordable, and you started seeing sewing machines in people's homes. So two main takeaways is that, no, there were sewing machines before that, but around 1851 was when he got the sewing machine patented that we recognize today in the configuration that we think of as a modern sewing machine.
So we talk about the sewing machines because it affects what the ladies and the men, gents, children have to wear. So if more sewing machines are available, then people can make their own, because most people had a maidservant to help them, but a lot of them, they were just like you and me, they did not. They took care of themselves. So during this time period, what was a big thing that happened in the mid-1860s? So we have the Civil War. And it not only affected the men in the country, it affected what was available to the women to make their clothes out of. So Jubilee was going to talk about this. An interesting thing is In the style, of course, we talked about Napoleon and how his influence influenced the fashion. During this time, you see a lot of military details. You'll see braiding on the sleeves, because the military also, you've seen their costumes. The French, they have these elaborate gold braiding and buttons and all of this. So that's what you started seeing showing up in the ladies' dresses. A lot of navy braiding, the military influence of Zouave. Susan's a big sewer. She has a whole collection of those things. But I'd like for Julie to tell us a little bit about how the scarcity of fabric happened and what the ladies did because of it.
We fast forward kind of from where Brad was talking about with the invention of the sewing machine, and we get to the Civil War. And at the time of the Civil War, the South was the leading producer of cotton, as most people know. And the cotton was harvested in the South, but it was exported to the North, if you want to call it exported, but it was shipped to the North, where it was then milled and created into fabric and printed and then widely distributed. And in this country, in America, we had absolutely fabulous cotton and very affordable cotton. Well, what happened with the Civil War was the Union, at the very beginning of the Civil War, all imports were stopped for a short period of time. Even foreign imports were stopped for a short period of time. But throughout the Civil War, the Union did a blockade, and so the South was no longer shipping or able to ship their cotton to the North. So there became a shortage of cotton fabrics in the North because of this. Well, the way they got around that is the imports were then resumed from England and France, and so they were able to import their fabrics. And we know from fashion magazines that were of the time period, one of them was called Godey's Ladies Book. It was printed, they had magazines printed in Boston and Philadelphia and New York. And we know from that time period that the New York fashions and the northern fashions did not change or suffer much from the Civil War. Now, on the other hand, in the South, where we had no one to process our cotton and we had no way of importing things, what ended up happening is there was a shortage of fabric in the South. And so what the ladies of the South did is they took everything that they had that was linen, silk. If they had a silk dress, they cut it up to make it into flags. If they had a mattress, they opened up the mattress and they relearned to spin. Now, at this time, women were not spinning and looming in the South anymore. It was being shipped to the North. So they had to relearn these skills. They relearned to spin and they learned to weave, and they did what was called homespun fabrics. And so they made their own fashions and dresses out of their homespun fabrics, which was from mattress fillings and stuff like that. And so it took on a fashion kind of its own. They had their own homespun dresses. They usually used short yardage, whereas someone might have 7, 8, 9, 10 yards of fabric, depending on how wealthy or showy you wanted to be during the Civil War time. They would have done it with short yardage, and meaning much less yardage. And so they used their homespun fabrics and they made their dresses. Now, if they still had hoop skirts, sometimes they would put the cottons directly onto the hoops and just wear it like that. And so in one of the diaries that we read, it talked about there being kind of a liberation from having to be expected to wear the latest fashion. They felt kind of in a way liberated, or like they had their own fashions of the time because of the homespun fabrics. Do we want to talk about the importance of fashion in the 1800s, or?
Sure. Yeah, and just remember talking about repurposing, reusing is not a new idea. The 1860s, you might have 7 layers of underclothes, and realize at this time, life is still going on. They needed baby clothes, so they would take those layers and do without and make that into baby clothes, make military uniforms. The soldiers needed wool for socks, gloves, and uniforms. So it's just like anything else. The ingenuity of the ladies during this time was very impressive. Just like you would do if there was a shortage, you'd find any way to make up for that. Do you want to go on to that?
Or do you want to talk about the influences of fashion, or do you want to talk about the importance of it?
Sure, whatever you want. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to organize a whole entire century into a short talk, but back in the 1800s, I think the difference between the fashions of that time and nowadays were a young lady's life literally depended on how she dressed and how she looked, because mostly her only options were to marry well. And so she wanted to look as fashionable as possible, and so it was very important for them to spend most of their time, most of their thought thinking about their outfit, looking at pictures, drawings of what was considered fashionable, and then creating that or having it created for them if they had the means to do that. And in this country, from what I have read, because the cottons were so prevalent, even the poorest of people could somewhat emulate the very fashionable things. They might not have had the trimmings, the trimmings would separate them, or they may not have had silk, they may have had a plainer cotton or something like that, but they could get the overall silhouette. But it was very important for a young lady to be seen as conforming to the fashion of the day, because she would be seen as respectable or decent. Someone that did not do that was not considered a respectable person. And so you basically had these silhouettes throughout decades that, as they changed, the young ladies would have to change and adapt. And they would do this in order to basically attract a man, to be able to get married and have a good life for themselves. One of the other things that's kind of interesting, and Marguerite sort of touched on it, was the undergarments and the amount of effort that would take to get dressed. You had so many layers of clothes, and even the undergarments, the ladies would spend time embroidering their petticoats, and even their undercuffs on their sleeves would have embroidery on them. They would spend so much time on these outfits with the specific purpose of just being able to attract a man. Or if they were a woman that had a profession such as a mill girl or a teacher, they would spend up to half of their income on fabric and clothing for themselves for a year.
Julie has a nice overview of the silhouettes throughout the 1800s. We have a couple copies she's going to pass around. And so we're up to about the 1870s. So what's happening at that time period? One of the things that influenced fabric, textile, was the Industrial Revolution. So Brad talked about all the machines that are available, but what's getting more available are the looms. So a lot of the fabric, the good fabric in the 1800s came from Europe. Well, in the late 1800s, we started getting mills here in the United States. The first ones were up north, but we were starting to get mills and looms that could do more than 3 colors. 3 colors was originally all they could do. Well, we started getting looms that could do 5 colors, 7 colors, 9 colors. So Amber, would you stand up? So you can see the print that she has on this is Regency style. So it's a base color of just a cream or an ivory, and then printed on there would be a small flower, or that sometimes Napoleon liked bees for whatever reason. So bees, they liked Greek key. They liked, it was an interest in, like, could be pineapples, fruit, whatever. So you could see that the design on her dress has several colors in there, browns and gold and green. So thank you. So this was like the possibility of textiles were exploding to women at this time. You have to imagine if you've been limited to 3 colors and all of a sudden you've got a wider palette. It was exciting, and they're becoming more available because now they're in the U.S. and the price is dropping. So Julie was talking about the expense. So a dress like what Chloe has on might use enough fabric. The amount of fabric for that might be the same as a pound of sugar or a pound of flour. And ladies, no matter how limited they were, they're still going to have that fabric. They are going to find a way to get fabric for a new dress, new bonnet. There are quotes from a book that General Custer's wife wrote in her memoirs. And she was talking about how they came to New Orleans, and he indulged her in a fabric store. And they lingered for quite too long. But she remarked that she just had to replace that bonnet that was 3 years old. because it was looking so worn. So ladies are going to have new things, they're going to have their fabric. So speaking of that, in the late 1800s, the dress that I'm wearing is from the 1890s. You'll see on the thing that's passing out, it's been said that the decade of 1890 could somewhat be compared to the whole century of 1800 in the changes that happened in just the decade of 1890. So you'll see on there that it started, and maybe the dress was narrower, the skirt was narrower, it had a shelf back from a bustle, so there's a bustle under here. So we've gone from the Regency where there was a shelf bust, now the emphasis is here, emphasis on the waist again, but you'll see that the colors are exploding. The textiles are vibrant. And then in the mid-1890s, you'll see that the sleeves all of a sudden get very big. And then at the end of the 1890s, it changes again. So even within that 10-year period, there was a change. So this dress, I made this from a historical pattern. It's from 1896, and you can see it in the magazine called The Delineator. The Delineator was the ladies' magazine that had everything in it. So some of the aspects of this dress, you can see, of course, it has voluminous leg of mutton sleeves. The emphasis again is on the waist. It's narrow, so it's narrow, big, and narrow, big, along with the bustle in the back. The skirt, you can't really see, but it's straighter in the front, and most of the volume is kicked out toward the back. That's similar with any kind of bustle. So what was happening at this time period that would cause this? Why would a woman want to have these huge sleeves? Well, women were starting to realize that they wanted to do more than just be at home and be a wife. They could not vote. They could not really hold a job. Well, at this time, women were wanting to do more than just have a social presence and a social function, although they did do that. A big influence was in 1885. They had the Cotton Exposition right down the road in New Orleans. So this was not only for crops. They had cotton and they had sugarcane and they had people from all over the world came to this. While the men were over here talking about the crops and the innovation, the women were over here and they were talking about fashions and textiles and new things. So this is meant to create space. So if I walk in a room and I've got these big shoulders, first you're going to notice it. And it's meant to be formidable, so that, and powerful, to show power. I've got these big sleeves, I need my space, you better respect me, and I mean business. So that's what this was meant for. Of course, the accessories, I couldn't get a bigger hat, but everything was big like this. In the Delineator, they show the fashion plate for someone wearing this. She is walking like a Great Dane. So big, impressive dog, scary dog, you better take me seriously. So what happened from here on out? Well, in a short 20 years from this time period would be the women's suffrage movement. So and as you know, they finally did get the right to vote and hold a job, and the rest is history, as you know. So there is some significance about this. I didn't mention one other thing about this dress. We've gone from the shelf bust to the small waist. Do you see that there's gathers right here? And these little things, these little insets could be put on the inside or they could be put on the outside. I chose to put mine on the inside. The silhouette, as you may know, going into the 1900s became the pigeon-breasted silhouette. They called it the monobism. So there's no separation, it's just the dove breast. And there's an interesting silhouette here. You want to talk about that?
Yes. We all know about the fashions of our time period that are widely mocked. I'm sure that y'all can think of something in the news that you've seen in the last 20 or 30 years that you think, oh my goodness, what were they thinking? You know, I personally, when I think of something like that, is the pants around the waist or pants around the hips, pants around the mid-thighs, to me is ridiculous. I look at that and I think that's ridiculous. I can think of a few other things from the 80s that kind of, the big giant triangular shoulders, I think was, kind of ridiculous looking. But in the late 1860s, 1868, they developed what was called the Grecian Bend. And I'm going to pass this around because it's really too much. You have to see it to believe it. The lady would actually walk like this. And she had a device that was attached to her waist and to her legs that would pull her down and actually try to protrude her rear end. And they called this the Grecian Bend. And this was something that was popular for a number of years, about 3 years. And it was widely mocked in the newspapers. And they had satirical cartoons mocking it. They had doctors that were saying at the time that the young ladies were going to end up with back problems. They had, all kinds of different things. That's just 3 examples of cartoons from the period of time mocking the fashion. So much similar to today, where we have some that are mocked at times.
So it is today, women still will endure some personal discomfort to have the silhouette of the day. I have seen diagrams of potentially what happened to a woman's internal organs because she wore a corset every single day. And it really is, it's almost disgusting, because if you, like, I have a corset on, and if you tie, a corset can decrease a woman's waist by 4 inches. All right, you pull that up, something's got to go somewhere. It's either got to go up or it's got to go down. So a lot of things went down. The liver, the intestines, your stomach, your spleen would all be pushed down. And this would not change during maternity. They had maternity panels on skirts like this. They would still wear their corset. Maybe the waist would come up here, but they're still going to look right. So it did change. And as a woman, I could say I'm very thankful we don't wear corsets anymore. It is comfortable, but it really is a commitment that I'm glad we don't have to make these days.
Talking about the corsets, there was a movement in the 1850s called the National, and I have to look it up, the National Dress Reform Movement. And it basically would take what would look like an 1860s dress, and they would cut it off at the knees, and then the ladies would wear trousers underneath the dress. And the purpose was for them to be able to do physical activity and all of this kind of stuff, and also possibly not wear a corset under this, although the photographs that I've seen of the time period, the women clearly still had the corsets on. So I'm not really sure, having been a person who's worn a dress like that, I don't really understand what the purpose of cutting it off at the knees is, because that's certainly not the most restrictive part of the dress. But they had, this started in about 1850, and it also gained prominence again in the mid-1860s, where they once again tried to do a dress reform movement to get away from the restrictive dress.
Does anyone else on the panel have anything to share? All right, we want to save time for a discussion. Does anyone have anything?
I have a question. Who made these rules? I mean, they changed the rules every...
The great rule maker. So, of course, for a lot of fashions, they do come from Paris. The fashion houses, the haute couture, they still, and today, a lot of it does come from Europe. But there, and I wanted to tell you too, we started to get that here in the U.S. And one thing we were talking about on the way up here was one of the fashion innovators here in Louisiana was a lady from France. Her name was Madame Olympe Boyce, and she was from France. She came to New Orleans, opened a business on Church Street in 1854, I think, and started making these dresses. It was like a millinery house. She was known for her hats and bonnets. But she found she needed a bigger shop, so she moved to Canal Street, and her address was 154 Canal Street. Today, Harrah's is on that land, but at the time, that's where the boats would dock, right there. If you've been down by the Audubon Aquarium, that end of Canal Street, that's where all the people would get off of the boat. So she had a prime location right there. And that is the fabric store that I told you about, General Custer's wife. That's where she stopped. People would come from around the world to go to her shop. Full service shop. They would make hats, They would make gloves, anything, any of the undergarments, foundations, of course the dresses, anything you want. There are pictures online of the dresses that she made. She was credited as one of the first American designers to put her label in her clothes. So if she sold you a dress, her name was on a label that's in her clothes. So there are extant dresses that are now still available in the Metropolitan Museum, and they do have her label. Her name is in that dress. So she first started copying French designers that she liked. Well, after a while, she just started making her own designs. So she was very popular. The Historic New Orleans collection, where we have danced there before, they have actual some items from her, like a receipt from her store is there, everything listed out in beautiful cursive pen and ink. They have a fan from the expo, the Cotton Expo 1885. She would have been a big presence there since that was right down the street. It was uptown. So that was the place to go. How are we doing on time? Do we have a full hour? We have 5 minutes. Does anyone else have a question? 5 minutes. Any other questions, discussion, addition?
I have a question.
Sure.
How did this all start?
What?
The dancing troupe. How did you all get together? How did you decide to do this
Well,
and educate people?
Some of it started, I've been around a long time, Susan. You know, there are reenactors who do reenacting of different things. Like around here, there's a lot of reenactors who reenact Civil War battles, and we have many historic sites around Louisiana. Some of the ladies wanted to have, I want to wear that big dress with the big hoop skirt. So the ladies get together. Well, you may not know that even during the war times, the reenactors, at an evening, they would get together and they would have a camp dance. It's called a camp dance. So the fiddler is usually with the band, the battalion, the soldiers. You might have someone who has a fife stuck in their pocket, a fiddle, a banjo maybe. So in the evening, they would relax with music. So they would get together and have a dance, a camp dance. So some of the ladies and the people from these reenactor groups got together and said, we want to do this all the time. So they started, LVD started in 1999.
I'm not sure about
Yeah.
I wasn't there from the beginning, so it was already going on at the time.
Yeah, I joined in 2001, so, and we've just been going ever since. We have a good group of people who have a lot of, besides being a good group of people, we have families and we have good people, we enjoy each other, but we also enjoy the music, the dancing. It's not exclusive for us, anyone can come. It's, this dancing that we do is called the aerobics of the 1800s. So there's Leah's our dance master, and after an hour and a half class with her every week, we have done our workout. So it's good for you. And Leah, would you talk about, there was a post you had on our Facebook about how dancing was better to ward off Alzheimer's than doing puzzles.
Yes, so there have been recent studies done in ways that you can basically help your brain to become more youthful and to take age off of your brain itself. And a lot of people have done puzzles, word puzzles, crosswords, all those types of things. But what they have found in their studies is that physical activity combined with having to learn complicated figures, which some of our dances have those figures in them, actually makes your brain younger and you're less likely to suffer from dementia type problems with the brain. So, yeah.
Not only that, but my husband has Parkinson's, and we've been going to Parkinson's conferences lately, and that is the big thing for Parkinson's people, are dance classes for Parkinson's. Even if they can't physically walk, dance movements done with their hands at least, to keep them flexible and to keep their brains going, because 1/3 of Parkinson's patients end up with dementia as well. And that's the big push is dancing. Plus it's fun.
It's fun. It is. It's just fun. And especially here in Louisiana, we have so many outlets for what we do. We have many around, we're based in Baton Rouge, so we have around there many mansions, Rural Life Museum, Rosedown, Oakley and St. Francisville. So there's a lot of places for us to dance. And we have return engagements every year. We have a very busy calendar. We're at Nottoway. You're welcome to check out our Facebook and our website because we do stay very busy and we just love it. So thank you to all the presenters. Thank you to NSU for having us. It's been a joy to be here. We will be on the main stage at 1:45. Come and dance. If you're ever in Baton Rouge, you need to come join us. Tuesdays, 7 o'clock every week at Lake Sherwood Village. We practice and we'd love to have you join us. So thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming.